The night was moonless. That was the first thing John F. Kennedy noticed when he took the con of PT-109 on the evening of August 1, 1943. The waters of Blackett Strait, wedged between the islands of Columbangara and New Georgia in the Solomon Islands chain, were as dark as ink and as warm as blood. Kennedy was 26 years old, a Harvard man, the son of one of the wealthiest and most politically connected families in America. He had used those connections to get himself assigned to the Pacific, to get himself a combat command, and to get himself into a war that had already consumed millions of men across 3 continents and 2 oceans. He stood at the helm of a vessel that was, by the standards of naval warfare, almost absurdly small. PT-109 was 78 feet long, built mostly of plywood, powered by 3 Packard aircraft engines that could push her to roughly 40 knots in calm water. She carried 4 torpedoes, 2 50-caliber machine guns, and a crew of 12 enlisted men and 1 other officer. Against a fleet destroyer, she weighed roughly 1/50th as much. Against the Japanese Imperial Navy, she was a mosquito. But mosquitoes, the Navy had promised, could kill giants. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. This channel covers the human stories of the Second World War that the history books tend to overlook. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. To understand what happened in Blackett Strait that night, and what it meant, not just for Kennedy personally, but for the broader mythology the United States Navy had spent 2 years constructing around its patrol torpedo boat program, you have to go back to the beginning of that mythology and examine how carefully it had been built, and how fragile it actually was. The PT boat was, by 1943, one of the most romanticized weapons in the American arsenal. The press had seized on it with an enthusiasm that bordered on propaganda. Journalists described PT boats as the mosquito fleet, swift and lethal, perfectly suited to the island-choked waters of the Pacific, where the big fleet destroyers and cruisers could not always maneuver. They were David's sling in a war full of Goliaths. They were democracy's answer to Japanese aggression, cheap, fast, crewed by young Americans with nerve and ingenuity rather than by career officers trained in the rigid traditions of battleship warfare. The mythology had a specific origin point, and it was one of the most dramatic moments of the entire Pacific War. In March of 1942, as the Philippines collapsed under the weight of the Japanese invasion and General Douglas MacArthur prepared to abandon his besieged garrison on Corregidor, it was PT boats that spirited him out through Japanese-controlled waters to Mindanao, from which he flew to Australia. The boats had slipped through the Japanese net under cover of darkness, threading among the islands, carrying MacArthur and his family and his staff to safety. "I shall return," MacArthur promised. And he had returned aboard a PT boat. That single mission had done more for the reputation of the PT boat program than any number of press releases could have managed. The boats became synonymous with audacity, with the kind of improvised, small-unit courage that Americans preferred to believe was their national military character. Congressional appropriations for the program increased. The press continued its lavish coverage. Young men volunteered for PT boat duty in numbers that exceeded the Navy's capacity to train and equip them. What the press coverage tended to omit, because it was complicated and did not fit the narrative, was the technical reality of what PT boats could and could not do. The torpedo, which was the PT boat's primary weapon and the entire justification for its existence, was a deeply problematic piece of equipment in the early years of the Pacific War. The Mark 14 torpedo, which American submarines and PT boats relied upon, had been developed during the 1930s under peacetime budget constraints that had prevented adequate live-fire testing. By the time the war began, Navy ordnance officers had discovered, through the painful experience of watching torpedoes fail to detonate against Japanese targets, that the Mark 14 had not one but 2 critical defects. The first was a tendency to run deeper than its set depth, which meant that torpedoes aimed at a ship's hull would pass harmlessly beneath it. The second was a defective contact exploder, the Mark 6, which had a firing pin mechanism so poorly designed that it would fail to detonate when striking a target at a direct 90-degree angle, precisely the angle that produced the highest chance of sinking a ship. In other words, the torpedo was most likely to malfunction when it hit exactly where it was aimed. These defects had been identified by submarine commanders as early as the first months of the war. They had written detailed reports. They had sent the reports up the chain of command. The Bureau of Ordnance, which had designed and manufactured the torpedo, had responded with institutional defensiveness rather than urgency, insisting that the problem lay with the men firing the weapons rather than with the weapons themselves. It would not be until September of 1943, after 2 years of war, that the defects were officially acknowledged and corrective modifications ordered. For the young men crewing PT boats in the Solomons in the summer of 1943, this meant that their primary weapon was, in a significant percentage of engagements, effectively useless. They knew this. They had fired their torpedoes at Japanese destroyers and watched the destroyers sail on untouched, unaware they had been targeted. They had made their reports and been told to check their techniques. The institutional explanation for why the weapons weren't working was always human error. The institutional explanation was almost always wrong. But even setting aside the torpedo problem, the entire strategic premise on which PT boats had been deployed in the Solomons required examination. The boats had been sent to Guadalcanal and the surrounding island chains to interdict the Tokyo Express, the name American sailors had given to the runs Japanese destroyers made down the slot, the body of water between the Solomon Islands, to supply and reinforce Japanese garrisons. The theory was logical. Fast, nimble PT boats, attacking at night, could use their speed and their low radar profile to get close to the Japanese destroyers before they could respond, fire their torpedoes, and escape. The theory had not survived contact with operational reality. Japanese destroyer commanders operating the Tokyo Express were experienced, aggressive, and operating in waters they had mapped with meticulous care. Their radar capability, which American naval intelligence had consistently underestimated, was in several key respects superior to American equipment at this stage of the war. Their ships were fast. The Fubuka-class destroyers that ran the Express were capable of 38 knots, barely slower than a PT boat in ideal conditions and faster than one in anything less than ideal conditions. And they had learned, quickly, how to use the darkness and the geography of the Solomons to their advantage. The PT boats, for all their celebrated speed, had a fundamental problem in combat. Their engines were loud. At anything above idle speed, the 3 Packard engines produced a distinctive roar that was audible miles away on a quiet night. This meant that the boat's primary tactical asset, surprise, was extremely difficult to achieve once it was operating at any meaningful speed. It also meant that when Japanese destroyers, alerted by sound or radar, turned their searchlights on and brought their guns to bear, the PT boats had very limited options. They could run and try to stay ahead of the shellfire, or they could press in, which meant exposing a 78-foot plywood vessel to the guns of a 1,200-ton warship. The combat record of PT boats in the Solomons by the summer of 1943 reflected these realities. In dozens of engagements against the Tokyo Express, American PT boat squadrons had achieved very modest results. They had occasionally disrupted supply runs, forced Japanese destroyers to take evasive action, and created enough nuisance value to justify their continued deployment. They had also suffered significant casualties, boats lost to Japanese gunfire, men killed, men wounded. The ratio of results to losses had not justified the mythology that had been constructed around the program. This was not a secret within the Navy. The squadron commanders in the Solomons were writing honest after-action reports. The reports described malfunctioning torpedoes, problems with coordination and communication on dark nights in confined waters, and the fundamental difficulty of coordinating small boat attacks against targets that were faster, better armed, and operated by experienced crews who had learned to expect PT boat attacks. But the mythology was too useful to examine honestly. The PT boat was a symbol of American initiative and ingenuity. It was the weapon that had saved MacArthur. It was the story that sold war bonds and filled recruitment offices and gave newspaper readers a narrative of American cleverness outmaneuvering Japanese brute force. Questioning the mythology would have required questioning a story that too many powerful people had invested too much in building. Kennedy himself had some awareness of the gap between the mythology and the operational reality. He had arrived in the Pacific in April of 1943, served briefly at Tulagi, and taken command of PT-109 in late April. He was a capable officer, his crew liked him, and the contemporaneous assessments of his superiors were generally positive, if not effusive. But he was operating with equipment that was, in certain critical respects, not performing as advertised, in tactical conditions that were genuinely dangerous, and in a strategic environment where the assumptions that had shaped his training were being continuously revised by experience. By August of 1943, Kennedy and his crew had been in the Solomons for several months. The campaign to take the island of New Georgia was in progress, and the Japanese were running the Tokyo Express regularly, bringing reinforcements and supplies to their garrison on Columbangara. PT boat squadrons were being tasked with intercepting these runs. The squadron's missions followed a pattern that had become grimly familiar. A group of boats, typically 8 to 15, would be dispatched to a patrol area, equipped with radio communication that worked unreliably in the interference-prone conditions of the Solomons, ordered to find and attack Japanese destroyers. They would motor out in the darkness, spread across the strait, and wait. On the night of August 1st, Kennedy's PT-109 was one of 15 boats assigned to patrol Blackett Strait. The mission was to intercept a Tokyo Express run that intelligence had indicated was carrying roughly 900 soldiers from Rabaul to Columbangara aboard 4 Japanese destroyers. The destroyers had left their base at Rabaul the previous afternoon and were making their run at speed. Kennedy deployed his boat to its assigned station in the strait and cut his engines to idle, listening. The darkness was almost total. The other boats in his patrol area had been designated by radio, but communication was sporadic. He was operating with only 2 of his 3 engines, because the third had a mechanical problem, a recurring issue with PT engines that operated best at high speeds and were prone to fouling when idled for extended periods. What happened next, in the small hours of August 2, 1943, would become one of the most analyzed and debated incidents in the Pacific War. Not because of its strategic significance, which was minimal, but because of who was aboard PT-109 when the Japanese destroyer Amagiri emerged out of the darkness at 30 knots and cut the boat in half. The Amagiri was a Fubuki-class destroyer, commissioned in 1930, displacing 1,600 tons, armed with 6 5-inch guns, 9 torpedo tubes, and anti-aircraft weapons. She was 118 meters long. She was, by any measure, a formidable warship. When she appeared out of the darkness, she was traveling at roughly 35 knots, roughly 40 miles per hour, on a course that would intersect with PT-109's position. Kennedy, running on a reduced engine configuration at low speed, had perhaps seconds of warning. The accounts of the crew members who survived describe seeing a dark shape emerge from the night, growing with terrifying speed, before impact. Kennedy reportedly called out a warning and reached for the throttles. He did not have time to turn the boat. The Amagiri struck PT-109 on the starboard bow at approximately 2:15 in the morning of August 2, 1943. The impact sliced the boat nearly in 2. The forward section, including the bow and the torpedo tubes, was sheared away. The remaining stern section, kept temporarily afloat by its sealed compartments, drifted in the darkness. 2 members of the crew, Morney and Kirksey, were killed instantly. The other 11 men, including Kennedy, were thrown into the water or clung to the wreckage. The Amagiri did not stop. She continued on her course and vanished into the darkness. She had not been damaged. She had probably not even recognized that she had struck an American vessel rather than a piece of floating debris. The torpedo boat, for all the mythology built around it, had been obliterated in less than 2 seconds of contact with a real warship. In Tokyo, the incident would not be recorded as a battle. It would not appear in the combat logs of the Japanese destroyer force as an engagement. It would appear, if it appeared at all, as a notation about floating debris in Blackett Strait. The disparity between the mythology of the Mosquito Fleet and the reality of an actual encounter between a plywood patrol boat and a fleet destroyer had been settled, violently and decisively, in the darkness of the Solomon Islands. But the story did not end there. Because now, clinging to a piece of burning wreckage in Japanese-controlled waters, surrounded by oil fires and the bodies of 2 of his men, with 10 survivors depending on him and no rescue in sight, John Kennedy had to make a series of decisions that would reveal something about the nature of leadership that the mythology of the PT boat program had never been designed to address. The immediate situation was this. The remaining section of PT-109 was on fire. Kennedy ordered his men away from it, fearing the fuel tanks would explode. The survivors swam clear and gathered in the water approximately 100 yards from the wreckage. An immediate search of the area for the other PT boats in the patrol produced nothing. Kennedy fired his service pistol into the air, hoping to attract attention. Nothing. The other PT boats had either not seen the collision or had assumed no one had survived. Of the 11 survivors with Kennedy, several were injured. The most seriously hurt was Charles Harris, who had burns on his hands, and Patrick McMahon, the oldest man on the boat at 37, who had suffered severe burns over much of his body when the collision ruptured the fuel lines. McMahon could barely move in the water. He would need to be towed. Kennedy swam to McMahon, put the strap of the engineer's life jacket in his teeth, and began towing him through the strait. He would tow McMahon for 4 hours that night, through shark-infested waters, before reaching a small island called Plum Pudding Island, later renamed Kennedy Island, that he had identified as a possible refuge. The swim was roughly 3.5 miles. This was not the mythology of the PT boat program. This was not the dashing young officer in the wheelhouse, darting through Japanese waters at 40 knots, launching torpedoes at fleet destroyers. This was a 26-year-old man with a bad back. He had injured his spine playing football at Harvard, and the collision had aggravated it severely, towing a burned and barely conscious shipmate through dark water while trying not to think about what was underneath him, toward an island that might or might not be occupied by Japanese soldiers. The Kennedy that emerged from that swim was a different figure from the one the mythology would later construct. The heroism was real, but it was not the heroism of the Mosquito Fleet legend. It was quieter, more personal, more physical, and more frightening. It was the heroism of a man who had just watched his boat get cut in half and who had concluded, without any particular drama, that his job now was to keep his men alive. Over the following 5 days, Kennedy would demonstrate a persistence and a resourcefulness that impressed even the skeptics who later examined the record closely. He organized the survivors, rationed their water and what little food they could find, conducted solo swimming reconnaissance of the surrounding islands to determine which were occupied by Japanese troops, and eventually made contact with native Solomon Islanders working with the Allied Coastwatching Network. The Coastwatchers, a network of Australian and New Zealand civilians and military personnel who had stayed behind in the islands after the Japanese occupation to report on Japanese movements, were one of the unsung intelligence successes of the Pacific War. They operated with extraordinary courage, living in the jungle, communicating by radio, relying on the loyalty of the island populations they had built relationships with over years of pre-war residence. It was through this network that Kennedy was able to get a message out. The famous coconut shell, on which Kennedy scratched a message, Nauru Island. Commander. Native knows posit. He can pilot. 11 alive. Needs small boat. Kennedy, and which he gave to a Solomon Islands scout named Biukugasa to carry to the nearest coastwatcher station, was not simply a clever improvisation. It reflected Kennedy's understanding that the formal rescue channels had failed. No one had come looking for PT-109, and that survival required working with whatever was available. Rescue came on August 8, 6 days after the collision. A New Zealand infantry patrol boat guided by the Solomon Islands scouts found the survivors on Olasana Island. All 11 men who had survived the initial sinking were alive. The story, as the Navy and the American press would tell it, was a story of heroism and ingenuity. Kennedy had saved his men. He had shown leadership under pressure. He had demonstrated the qualities, resourcefulness, physical courage, concern for his crew, that the Navy wished to celebrate. What the official story was somewhat less forthcoming about was the question of how PT-109 had come to be rammed by a Japanese destroyer in the first place, and what that event revealed about the gap between the mythology of the PT boat program and its operational reality. The Navy conducted an informal inquiry into the loss of PT-109. The inquiry was not a court-martial proceeding. It was an internal review conducted by the squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Warfield. The inquiry concluded that no negligence or misconduct on Kennedy's part had contributed to the loss of the boat. Kennedy had been operating under difficult conditions with limited equipment, and the collision had been, in the inquiry's judgment, an unfortunate accident. But the inquiry also touched, carefully, on the broader issues of communication, coordination, and tactics that had contributed to the situation. The 15 boats patrolling Blackett Strait that night had failed to coordinate effectively. PT-109 had been essentially alone in its patrol sector when the Japanese destroyers came through. The radio communications that should have kept the boats informed of the destroyer's approach had broken down. The tactical doctrine that assumed PT boats could interdict fleet destroyers in confined waters at night had once again been tested and found wanting. These were not comfortable conclusions for a program that had been built on the promise of the Mosquito fleet. They were, however, honest conclusions, and they were consistent with what PT boat commanders had been reporting throughout the Solomons campaign. If you're finding this story as compelling as I am, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who care about the human stories behind these events. The mythology and the reality had been on a collision course since the beginning of the PT boat program, in much the same way that PT-109 and the Amajiri had been on a collision course in the darkness of Blackett Strait. The outcome, in both cases, was determined not by narrative or by institutional commitment to a story, but by the unforgiving arithmetic of mass, speed, and time. A fleet destroyer, displacing 1,600 tons, traveling at 35 knots, does not yield to a plywood boat because the plywood boat has a better story. It does not yield because young men of exceptional courage are aboard the plywood boat. It does not yield because the mythology of American ingenuity demands a different outcome. It yields only if the plywood boat's torpedoes work, and only if the plywood boat's crew sees it coming in time, and only if the tactics are sound, and only if the equipment is reliable. In the Solomons in the summer of 1943, none of those conditions were reliably present. The torpedoes were defective. The communications were unreliable. The tactics were built on assumptions that the Japanese had already learned to defeat. And the darkness in Blackett Strait was absolute. Kennedy survived. His men survived. And the story of their survival would follow Kennedy for the rest of his life, shaping his political identity, his public image, and ultimately his path to the presidency. But the story that the survival became, in the hands of American mythology, was not quite the story of what had actually happened in those waters. What had actually happened was this. A young naval officer commanding an underarmed, mechanically compromised patrol boat in waters controlled by an experienced enemy had been struck by a fleet destroyer that he never saw coming, had lost his boat and 2 of his men in an instant, and had then spent 6 days demonstrating the kind of quiet, physical, utterly unglamorous leadership that keeps men alive in impossible circumstances. That story, the true story, is in some ways more impressive than the mythology. It does not require a functioning torpedo or a heroic charge at a Japanese warship. It requires only a man who, when everything has gone wrong, looks at his burned and exhausted crew and decides that his job is to get them home. But it is also a story that sits uncomfortably alongside the mythology of the Mosquito fleet, because it confirms what the squadron commanders had been reporting for months and what the Bureau of Ordnance had been refusing to acknowledge. That the tools were flawed, that the tactics were flawed, and that the young men sent out in those plywood boats were being asked to do something that the equipment and the doctrine, as they existed in the summer of 1943, could not reliably support. The collision between PT-109 and the Amajiri was, in this sense, more than a single incident in a minor patrol action in a secondary theater of the Pacific War. It was the moment when the mythology of the Mosquito fleet made contact with a Japanese destroyer, and the Japanese destroyer did not stop. The survivors reached Rendova Harbor on August 8, 1943, thin and sunburned and quiet in the way that men are quiet when they have been frightened for a long time and the fear has only just begun to leave their bodies. Kennedy stepped off the rescue boat looking, by one account, like a man 10 years older than the one who had left 6 days earlier. His back was in serious pain. The collision had compressed spinal injuries he had carried since Harvard, and the days of swimming and sleeping on coral had made them considerably worse. He would be evacuated to a field hospital within days, where the doctors who examined him would note that he had no business being in a combat zone at all, medically speaking, and had probably had no business being there before the collision. The men of PT-109's crew were examined, debriefed, and in the cases of the most seriously injured, prepared for evacuation. Patrick McMahon, the engineer whom Kennedy had towed through the strait with his life jacket strap clenched in his teeth, required extensive treatment for his burns. He would recover, and he and Kennedy would maintain a correspondence for the rest of Kennedy's life. A connection that neither man ever entirely knew how to talk about in public, because what had passed between them in the water was not the kind of thing that translated well into words. The debriefs were conducted by the squadron's intelligence officer, and they were detailed and honest, as far as they went. The crew members described the darkness, the reduced engine configuration, the appearance of the Amajiri out of the night, the impact, the fire, the swim. Kennedy himself gave a full account. The accounts were consistent with each other and with the physical evidence. What little of PT-109 had been recovered, which was not much. What the debriefs could not fully address, because addressing it honestly would have required a broader institutional reckoning that no one in the chain of command was prepared to initiate, was the question of systemic failure. The question of why 15 boats patrolling a single strait had failed to coordinate effectively. The question of why the radio communications had been so unreliable. The question of why the tactical doctrine that sent PT boats to intercept fleet destroyers in confined waters at night continued to be employed despite a mounting record of results that did not justify the cost. These questions existed in the debriefs as implications, not as explicit charges. The officers conducting the inquiry were themselves PT boatmen. They understood the conditions. They were not going to write a report that condemned the program, or the tactics, or the equipment, because doing so would have required them to condemn themselves and their colleagues. They wrote an honest account of what had happened and reached the conclusion that no one had done anything wrong, which was technically accurate and strategically incomplete. Lieutenant Commander Warfield, who had commanded the squadron that night, accepted responsibility for the overall coordination failures without quite acknowledging what those failures implied about the limits of PT boat tactics in those waters. He made adjustments to his patrol procedures. He issued revised guidance on communication protocols. He did what commanders do when things go wrong within a framework they are not authorized to question. He made the best available improvements within the existing framework and moved on. Kennedy returned to duty after his hospitalization, commanded a second PT boat for a period, and was eventually sent home to the United States in January of 1944, having been recommended for the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his actions following the sinking. The recommendations cited his leadership, his courage in towing McMahon, his persistence in seeking rescue, and his success in keeping his crew alive. It did not cite any action taken against the enemy, because Kennedy's combat against the enemy had consisted, in its entirety, of having his boat cut in half before he could do anything about it. This was not a reflection on Kennedy. It was a reflection on what the PT boat program was actually able to accomplish in the Solomons campaign, versus what it had been promoted as being able to accomplish. The medal was deserved, but it was deserved for survival and leadership, not for the aggressive torpedo attacks against Japanese destroyers that the program had been sold on. The mythology and the citation were for different wars. The broader PT boat program continued in the Solomons and across the Pacific for the remainder of the war, and it did eventually find a role that suited its actual capabilities better than the torpedo attack mission that had defined its early deployment. As the war progressed, PT boats were used increasingly for reconnaissance, for rescue operations, for harassing fire against shore installations, and for screening larger vessels in confined waters. These were missions that made genuine use of the boat's speed and shallow draft without requiring them to close with fleet destroyers. The casualty rate declined. The results improved. But this evolution happened slowly and at considerable cost, and it happened because the tactical reality of what PT boats could and could not do had been learned through experience rather than through an honest pre-deployment assessment of the program's limitations. The mythology had gotten there first, and the mythology was expensive. The Mark 14 torpedo problem was officially acknowledged and corrected in September of 1943, roughly 1 month after the Amajiri rammed PT-109. The correction was not a simple fix. It required modifications to both the depth-running mechanism and the contact exploder, and it took additional months before the modified weapons were widely distributed to the fleet. Submarine commanders, who had been complaining about the torpedo's defects since December of 1941, reacted to the official acknowledgement with a mixture of relief and fury that was entirely understandable. For 21 months, they had been told that their targeting was at fault. For 21 months, the Bureau of Ordnance had defended a defective weapon by blaming the men who used it. The human cost of that institutional defensiveness is difficult to calculate precisely, but it is not difficult to characterize. Every Japanese ship that survived a submarine or PT boat attack because a Mark 14 torpedo ran too deep or failed to detonate on contact represented a supply run completed, a garrison reinforced, a transport that unloaded soldiers and equipment that was subsequently used against American forces. The torpedo's defects did not lose the war. The industrial and strategic advantages the United States possessed were too large to be overcome by a single equipment failure. But they extended it, and the extension had a price. Kennedy left the Pacific in early 1944 in poor health. His back required surgery. He had lost significant weight. He was, at 26, carrying the physical consequences of what he had put his body through in the days after the Amagiri's bow had cut through PT-109's hull, and he would carry those consequences for the rest of his life. The spinal problems would require multiple surgeries over the following decades. The pain would be a constant companion. The medication required to manage the pain would itself become a complicating factor in his health. The 18 minutes in Blackett Strait would follow Kennedy and his body long after they had been transformed in the public imagination into something cleaner and more triumphant than they had actually been. The transformation began almost immediately. In August of 1944, a year after the sinking, John Hersey published an account of the PT-109 incident in the New Yorker magazine. The article, titled Survival, was based on extensive interviews with Kennedy and his crew, and it was a model of the kind of narrative journalism that the New Yorker did better than almost anyone. Hersey was a serious writer who had already covered the Pacific War with distinction, and his account was careful, detailed, and largely accurate. It emphasized the physical reality of what Kennedy and his men had endured. The days in the water, the coral, the hunger, the uncertainty about whether rescue would come. But the article's very appearance in the New Yorker, and the subsequent condensed version published in Reader's Digest, arranged, it later emerged, by Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, who understood the political value of a heroic war narrative for a son he was already thinking of in political terms, began the process of mythologization that would eventually obscure the more complicated truth. The Reader's Digest condensation reached millions of readers. It became the version of the story that most Americans knew. It presented Kennedy as a naval hero, which was accurate as far as it went, but it framed his heroism within the mythology of the Mosquito Fleet, the dashing young officer, the swift torpedo boat, the duel in the South Pacific darkness, rather than within the more honest framework that Hearst's original article had gestured toward. The young officer whose boat had been sunk before he could do anything, who had then demonstrated extraordinary personal courage in keeping his men alive through days of pure endurance. These are not the same story. The first is the story of a warrior. The second is the story of a survivor and a leader. The second is in many ways the more impressive and the more instructive, but it is not the story that sells war bonds or builds political careers, and so it was not the story that persisted. When Kennedy ran for Congress in 1946, and for the Senate in 1952, and for the presidency in 1960, the PT-109 story was a central element of his political identity. Miniature coconut shells like the one on which he had scratched his distress message were produced as souvenirs. The story appeared in campaign literature. Kennedy wore his Navy service as a credential with genuine legitimacy. He had served, he had been in combat, he had been tested, but the version of the service that was politically useful was the one that fit the mythology of the Mosquito Fleet rather than the one that reflected the more ambiguous operational reality. This is not an accusation against Kennedy. He did not fabricate his heroism. What he did, or what was done around him, with his implicit cooperation, was allow the mythology to become the dominant narrative, because the mythology was more useful than the truth and because the truth, while not discreditable, required more explaining than a political campaign had space for. The men who served with him, for the most part, supported the mythologized version, and their support was not purely calculating. They genuinely admired Kennedy's leadership in the days after the sinking. They genuinely believed he had saved their lives, and by any reasonable measure he had. Their loyalty to him was real. But their loyalty also reinforced the frame that emphasized Kennedy's heroism in the rescue rather than the questions that surrounded the loss of the boat. And those questions, over time, receded from public view entirely. They receded, but they did not disappear. In the late 1960s and through the 1970s, as the PT-109 story became an established piece of American political mythology, burnished by Kennedy's presidency, consecrated by his assassination, and eventually enshrined in a Hollywood film released in 1963 with Cliff Robertson playing Kennedy, a number of historians and journalists began to ask the questions that the official accounts had elided. The most pointed question was the one that the informal Navy inquiry had approached but not directly addressed. whether Kennedy bore any responsibility for allowing his boat to be rammed. The accusation, when it was made, most prominently by writers researching Kennedy's pre-presidential career, was specific. Kennedy had been running on reduced engines. He had been idling in an area where Japanese destroyers were known to be operating. He had not been maintaining adequate watch. He had not seen the Amagiri until it was too late to maneuver clear. The counter-arguments were also specific. The darkness had been complete. The Amagiri had been traveling at extraordinary speed. The communications failures that night had been systemic, not individual. Other PT boats in the patrol had also failed to detect or respond to the Japanese destroyer's passage. Kennedy's reduced engine configuration, while tactically limiting, was not unusual. PT engines had well-documented fouling problems at low speeds, and commanders regularly operated on reduced power while on patrol. The historical assessment that has emerged over the decades is not that Kennedy was a negligent commander, but rather that he was an inexperienced one operating in genuinely difficult conditions with equipment and tactical doctrine that were inadequate to the demands being placed on them. This is not a verdict of cowardice or incompetence. It is a more honest reckoning than the mythology allows for, and it points toward the institutional failures of the PT boat program rather than toward any particular failure of the men who crewed the boats. The Navy's PT boat program ended with the war. The boats were decommissioned, sold, transferred to Allied navies, or simply abandoned on Pacific beaches where the tropical climate took them apart at a pace that the war had not managed. The Mosquito fleet dissolved back into the mythology from which it had partly emerged, leaving behind a historical record that was more complicated and more instructive than the legend. The Japanese destroyer Amagiri survived the war in the Solomons but not the war itself. She was sunk by a mine in the Strait of Malacca on April 23, 1944, roughly 8 months after her bow had cut PT-109 in half in Blackett Strait. She went down without leaving survivors. The men who had been on her bridge on the night of August 2, 1943, who had felt the impact of the collision and continued on their course without knowing or perhaps without caring what they had struck, were gone. The Solomon Islands scout Byuku Gasa, who had carried Kennedy's coconut shell message to the Coast Watcher station and whose role in the rescue had been largely overlooked in the American accounts of the incident, lived until 2005. In his later years, he gave interviews in which he described the events of August 1943 with a clarity and specificity that the more celebrated accounts sometimes lacked. He remembered Kennedy as a tall, thin man who was clearly in pain and who spoke quietly and did not waste words. He remembered the coconut shell. He remembered the look on Kennedy's face when Gasa indicated, through gestures and a few words of shared pidgin English, that he understood the message and would take it where it needed to go. What Gasa remembered, in other words, was not the mythology. He remembered a man in a difficult situation making a practical decision about how to use the resources available to him. He remembered leadership stripped of its institutional context, no rank, no equipment, no chain of command, reduced to its most basic elements: clarity of purpose, physical commitment, and the ability to communicate across a language barrier what needed to happen and why. This is the Kennedy that the mythology struggles to accommodate, because the mythology requires a hero and heroes require enemies and enemies require combat. The Kennedy that Gasa remembered was not fighting anyone. He was trying to get his men home. The broader significance of what happened in Blackett Strait on August 2, 1943 extends beyond Kennedy's biography and beyond the operational history of the PT boat program. It is a story about the cost of institutional mythology, about what happens when a narrative about what a weapon can do becomes more important to the people managing the program than an honest assessment of what the weapon actually does. The PT boat was not a bad weapon. It was a weapon that had been oversold, deployed in conditions that exceeded its design parameters, armed with torpedoes that did not reliably function, and employed in tactical roles that it could not consistently fulfill. The men who crewed the boats were not at fault for these institutional failures. They were young, they were brave, they were operating with what they had been given, and they were doing their best in waters where the enemy was experienced and capable and where the darkness was not equally dangerous for both sides. But the mythology that surrounded the program had consequences. It affected procurement decisions. It affected deployment decisions. It affected the way after-action reports were written and the way the reports were read by commanders who did not want to challenge a program that had the press, the public, and in some cases the personal interest of senior officers behind it. The mythology made honest assessment more difficult, and difficult assessment made tactical improvement slower, and slower improvement cost lives. This is not a uniquely American failure. It is not even uniquely a wartime failure. Institutional investment in a narrative that is partly wrong is one of the most consistent features of large organizations operating under pressure, and the United States military in the Second World War was a large organization operating under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The wonder is not that the PT boat mythology persisted as long as it did, but that the operational reality eventually forced its revision, imperfectly and at significant cost, but in time for the boats to find roles they could actually fill. Kennedy came home from the Pacific in the winter of 1944 and spent the remainder of the war in the United States, undergoing surgery and rehabilitation. His older brother, Joseph Kennedy Jr., was killed in August of 1944 in an experimental mission over the English Channel, when the aircraft he was piloting exploded prematurely. The death devastated the Kennedy family and redirected the political ambitions that Joseph Sr. had invested in his eldest son toward his second son, the one who had come home from the Solomons thin and damaged and carrying a story that, properly told, could be the foundation of a career. Kennedy was elected to Congress from Massachusetts in 1946. He was elected to the Senate in 1952. He was elected President of the United States in 1960. At his inauguration, he spoke of a new generation of Americans, tempered by war, and the line was received as biography as much as rhetoric, because everyone in the crowd knew the story of PT-109, or believed they did. What that generation had actually been tempered by, in Kennedy's specific case, was not quite the story the mythology described. It had been tempered by a collision in the dark with something much larger and faster than itself, and by 6 days of survival that had depended not on weaponry or tactical doctrine or institutional support, but on the willingness of one man to put his injured body between a Japanese engineer's burns and the water and swim. That is a genuine tempering. It produces something real. But it produces something different from what the mythology of the Mosquito Fleet promised, and the difference matters, because the mythology makes the tempering seem like a consequence of audacity, of the brave young officer in the fast boat, closing with the enemy, when in fact it was a consequence of catastrophe, and of what a man discovers about himself when the catastrophe has already happened and there is nothing left to do but endure. Kennedy understood this. In the interviews he gave, in the private conversations he had with people he trusted, he was consistently deflective about the heroism of PT-109. When asked about it, he would often say simply that it was easy, that the Navy had sunk his boat, and survival was the only option available. This was false modesty in one sense, because the survival had required genuine courage and extraordinary physical effort. But it was honest in another sense, because it refused the mythology's framing of what had happened as a triumph rather than as a disaster that had been partially redeemed. The distinction is not merely semantic. A triumph teaches you one thing about yourself. A disaster that you survive, and through which you bring others, teaches you something different, something about the limits of doctrine, the unreliability of equipment, the gap between what institutions promise and what reality delivers, and the irreducible importance, when everything else has failed, of the person standing next to you and your obligation to that person. These are lessons that the mythology of the Mosquito Fleet was not designed to teach. They are, however, lessons that the summer of 1943 in the Solomons taught to every man who served in those waters, whether or not their particular boat was cut in half by a Japanese destroyer. The plywood and the steel. The 40 knots and the darkness. The torpedo that ran too deep and the radio that crackled with static and the engines that fouled at idle speed. The mythology said these things could be overcome by courage and ingenuity. The Amagiri said they could not. The men who survived those waters knew which one was right. And the best of them, the ones who came home and lived the rest of their lives with what they knew, carried that knowledge quietly, without bitterness and without illusion, understanding that the gap between what is promised and what is possible is not a failure of individual will but a feature of the world, and that the only honest response to it is to see it clearly and to keep swimming anyway. That is what John Kennedy did in Blackett Strait. That is what it actually means to be tempered by war. And if the mythology that grew up around that night was larger and simpler and more triumphant than the truth, it was perhaps because the truth, a plywood boat cut in half, a man towing his burned engineer through the dark, 6 days of coral and hunger and uncertainty, was too quiet and too human and too devoid of the kind of enemy-vanquishing drama that mythology requires. The Amajiri didn't know she had made a president. She was just a destroyer running at 35 knots in the dark, doing what destroyers do to plywood boats when plywood boats are in the way. The mythology came later. The swimming was first. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe and share it with someone who would appreciate it. And if you have thoughts on the gap between military mythology and operational reality, leave them in the comments below. These are the conversations that make this channel worth making.